the greedy billionaire hedge fund managers that have Puerto Rico against the ropes have called on the Commonwealth to lay off teachers and close schools so that the island can pay them back the billions it owes. The group of 34 hedge funds hired a trio of former International Monetary Fund economists to come up with a solution to Puerto Rico's debt crisis after the island governor declared its $72 billion debt was unpayable, paving the way for bankruptcy, Margaret. And we did a great story here in the Leap 2 about the situation in Puerto Rico, the specifics, how it compares to Greece. But basically what's going on is Puerto Rico cannot pay the debt that it has to these hedge funds. These hedge funds are predatory vulture funds that they profit on collapsing economies and down on its luck banks. And now they hire these three guys from the International Monetary Fund, and they pull out an International Monetary Fund trick saying, no debt forgiveness, and instead we're going to make you struggle more, we're going to take money away from you, and you need to close schools. Guess what? Puerto Rico already this year closed 100 schools already.
Well, there is an issue with predatory lending here, but that aside, Puerto Rico has not been allowed to declare municipal bankruptcy, which would allow them to sell off public assets instead of shutting down schools. And, you know, that's one way of dealing with this. They're teetering on the edge of default, and if they went ahead and defaulted on this debt, they might have a better bargaining position instead of trying to negotiate with creditors because they're on the losing end of the stick here. They're said to have collected, or they are collecting 56% of their sales tax revenue, and most states collect 83% of that revenue. So if they had a better way of going after those types of monies out there, they perhaps wouldn't have to deal with these shark lenders at all.
It's exactly what they're asking. They're asking for more taxes, selling up to $4 billion worth of public buildings, and cutting down on public spending, specifically on education. And what they're saying is that while Puerto Rico enrollment has been down for 25% in the island, and this is mainly because people move out of the island into mainland to find better opportunities, to have better schools. But at the same time, they've been spending a lot more. There's 36% increase on educational spending. And what they're saying is either there's very bad administration because the actual money that they spend on each student is $200 less than the average U.S. amount that the school districts are spending every student. To this, one of these three guys that decided to be a specialist in Latin America, 32 years of experience in the IMF, they come up with this report that seems more like a pitch deck for them to deal with the crisis in behalf of these hedge funds. But Jose Fajgenbaum, one of the leaders of this group, the Centennial Group, it's a consultant firm, they said, the real expense per student has increased enormously without increasing the quality of education. It's for the government to decide how much to cut spending by, but you don't want to waste government resources. There has to be efficiencies. It is more important to establish a position for growth. And I think he has a point. I think that at a crisis like this, Puerto Rico needs to look into reform. It needs to cut down on indiscreet spending. It needs to make sure to take a strong look at corruption and any leaks of money that it could be. But at the same time, they already been doing this and asking to cut on education on a country where 56% of the kids are poor, live in poverty. I think it's a recipe for disaster, and it calls for the greed that hedge funds have to say, I don't care, just pay me my money, and I don't care what happens to your population, because my involvement with you ends as soon as I get my debt, paid back.
I mean, sure, of course it does. Look, Jose, I mean, debt restructuring schemes, they always favor the lender. Default on your house and find out what happens. The bank holds all the cards here. This is just like that. The problem is they're not allowed to do those customary routes. For example, Detroit, they were allowed to take from pensions, which I hate. I hate the thought of people, especially local and municipal governments, taking out of people's pensions, but they were allowed to do that in this case. Puerto Rico isn't. And perhaps if they had an alternative way of coming up with money, they wouldn't have to deal with their lenders. Unfortunately, the mainland seems to have abandoned them here, which is incredibly short-sighted. I mean, if Puerto Rico, let's say the default, what this means for them, even 50 years down the road, they could never recover.
I mean, and that's what many Puerto Ricans are saying. You guys are just
throwing
abandoned us to the lions. We don't know what is going to happen to Puerto Rico. Luis Gallardo, that is a local legislator in Puerto Rico, he said this is a typical IMF recipe for radical austerity, very much like what they're asking from Greece. And I quote, They are proposing teacher layoffs, cuts in higher education and health benefits, as well as increased taxes. These proposals have been a disaster for Latin America and will be so for Puerto Rico. Sure, Puerto Rico could pay its debt, but at what cost? We are literally cutting off our own limbs just to stay afloat. This report from Centennial Group comes right after another report from a former IMF economist, this one commissioned by Puerto Rico, which says the same findings of the deficit that Puerto Rico is at and the inefficiencies of the tax revenue, but in that report they say this crisis won't be solved unless the lenders agree to debt, restructuring and forgiveness. But how much is enough for the banks? I think that's a weird question because they don't have enough. Let us know how you feel, and please subscribe to LibTV2.